The manor chest lay open on the trestle table when Reynold Alderton lifted the parchment of division and read, with a smile that never reached his eyes, the name of Hawise. "To my father's widow," he said, before the assembled tenants of the manor court, "the derelict croft upon the hill. It will do well enough for an old woman's prayers." Laughter ran through the gathered airs, brief but clear, like a stone thrown into still water. Hawise, standing beside the court's wooden rail with her hands folded over her apron, did not lower her eyes. She waited for the clerk to finish entering the division, and only then did she speak. "Thank you, Reynold," she said, her voice steady. "May God grant you a good harvest upon the fields that remain yours." No one in that hall noticed, that day, how her eyes lingered a moment too long upon the name of the parcel written on the parchment, the croft and its spring, upon the high hill. A moment no one else understood, because no one else had climbed to that spring as a girl, with her own father, 40 years before the name of Osbert ever entered her life. To know how this story ends, how a widow shamed before an entire manor court came to decide the fate of every harvest in the valley, you must know Hawise from the beginning, months before that division, when she still worked Osbert's land without knowing her whole marriage was about to be reduced to a heap of stones atop a hill. Before we continue with this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We're always glad to know how far this story has traveled. To understand how we came to that hall, we must go back some months, to the day Osbert Alderton, Hawise's husband of 40 years, closed his eyes for the last time in the very bed where his first son by another woman had been born. The manor of Ashcombe stretched across gentle hills of oak and barley fields that in good years turned gold as far as the eye could see, all watered by ditches that ran, though few now remembered why, from a single spring atop the poorest hill of the domain. Hawise had come there as Osbert's second wife 30 years before, a young widow of a childless first marriage, and had found in the Alderton household 3 young stepchildren whose father did not know how to raise them alone. She had raised them as her own. She had buried 2 of them in years of fever and want, and had watched the third, Reynold, grow into the man who now, parchment of division in hand, dismissed her with a derelict croft and a shared laugh. "You were never my mother," Reynold had told her once, as a young man, in a fit of anger Hawise had never quite forgotten. "Only the woman my father brought into this house afterward." She had not answered then, and did not answer now, 30 years later, when the same man decided her place in the family ended with a ruined croft. Osbert had died without a formal will, as so many husbandmen of the shire did, trusting that custom and the manor court's good judgment would divide his lands fairly between his children and his widow. Reynold, eldest son and natural heir by custom, had taken the lead in the negotiations from the first day of mourning, visiting every tenant of standing with small gifts and careful words about what was fair and what was reasonable. "My father would have wanted the good fields kept together, under one hand," he repeated to whoever would listen. "Dividing the manor among too many owners brings nothing but boundary disputes for generations." What Reynold did not say aloud, not even fully to himself, was the fear that had followed him since boyhood, the fear that his father's estate would fracture among too many kin until nothing worth governing remained to him. Hawise, with her own widow's rights over part of the land, was the first obstacle to clear from his path. "She is not of my father's blood," he had told the lesser heirs, cousins and nephews with smaller claims. "Let her be content with what no one else wants, and we shall all profit by it." The day of the division came with a clear sky over the manor hall, where not only the direct heirs but a good many tenants had gathered, curious to see how the lands of one of the shire's oldest families would be parceled out. Hawise dressed in her best apron, determined to receive what fell to her with the same dignity she had carried through 30 years of marriage, though she already sensed, from whispered talk in recent days, that Reynold did not mean to treat her with generosity. She did not have to wait long. No sooner had the reading of the division begun than Reynold read his own name beside the manor's best fields, and those of his cousins beside lesser but productive parcels. When Hawise's turn came, he paused deliberately, as though savoring the moment, before reading, to the widow, the croft and its spring, upon the high hill. The laughter that followed, brief but clear, echoed through the whole hall. Hawise walked to the clerk, thanked him in a steady voice, took up her wooden dipper, the only thing she had brought with her that day, inherited from her own mother, and began climbing the hill path without looking back, while behind her the heirs already argued over how to divide the manor's best parcels among themselves. The path was long and steep, and Hawise climbed it with the same steady step she had walked the Alderton fields with for 30 years. Reaching the croft, she found the roof half fallen, the walls thick with brambles, and, beyond, the spring her own father had taught her to use when she herself was a girl, long before the name of Osbert had ever entered her life. That night, filling her dipper for the first time in 40 years in that same water, her fingers brushed something beneath the moss and accumulated earth beside the spring, stones arranged in a circle too regular to be chance, half-sunken, covered in lichen that spoke of decades untouched by any hand. If you have ever been given what no one else wanted, if you have ever been made to feel your place in a family depended on the generosity of others, then you already know something of the silence with which Hawise climbed that hill, carrying only a wooden dipper and the dignity no one could take from her. But stay with this story a little longer, because the justice that seems impossible is sometimes hidden beneath the moss of a forgotten spring, waiting only for someone with the patience to look closely. Hawise did not know it yet, but those stones would change not only her own fate, but that of the whole valley that had shamed her. The next morning, Hawise went down to the village and sought out Father Cuthbert, the parish priest, who as a young clerk decades before had copied entries from the nearby abbey's cartulary. She found him in the small parish chest room beside the church, surrounded by ledgers few in the manor still knew how to read. "Lady Hawise," he said, surprised. "I did not expect your visit, least of all so soon after the division. Father Cuthbert, I need you to tell me the truth about something I found yesterday," she said, without preamble. "There are stones around the spring at my croft, set in a circle, that do not look like the work of nature. Do you know anything of this?" The old priest was silent a long moment, his hands still upon the table. When he finally spoke, it was in a low voice, as though he feared the very walls might listen. "Lady Hawise, I copied entries from the abbey's cartulary as a young clerk, and I remember, faintly, a line mentioning the spring upon the hill, and certain stone markers that set its bounds. But so many years have passed that I never had cause to think on it again until now. Could you help me find it, Father Cuthbert?" The priest hesitated, and in that hesitation Hawise recognized something she had already seen in the men of the manor, the fear of crossing one with power. "Lady Hawise, if what you suspect is true, it would mean the spring that waters every good field in this valley rises within the very parcel Reynold gave you as though it were worth nothing. It is a revelation that could overturn the balance of this whole manor. I need time to search the abbey's cartulary among hundreds of similar entries, and to do it without Reynold learning what I seek." The days that followed brought a new humiliation, crueler than the first. Reynold, now settled into administering the manor's best fields, sent one of his men to the hill croft with a message that brooked no argument. Hawise must pay a small token rent to continue living in the very croft he himself had given her, so it be plain before the manor court that the family's generosity has its limits. "It is the fairest course for everyone," Reynold had declared before the other heirs, who nodded without daring to object. "None can accuse me of abandoning my father's widow if I ask but a single coin each month." Hawise paid the first coin without protest, but that same afternoon, climbing back to the hill, she found her granddaughter Editha waiting beside the spring, her face pale with indignation. "Grandmother, I cannot allow this. I will speak to Reynold, whatever comes of it." "No, child," Hawise answered, taking her hands. "Not yet. I am looking into something that may change everything, but I need time, and I need you to keep visiting me without anyone suspecting. You may prove useful in ways neither of us yet imagines." Editha, though frustrated by the waiting, trusted her grandmother as she always had, and that trust would become, in the weeks that followed, the quiet thread sustaining Hawaii's entire search for the truth. It was in those days of waiting that Hawaii's noticed something Editha herself had observed first, without knowing its importance. While the valley's common wells began to sink as summer advanced, the Croft's spring kept flowing with the same strength as ever, clear and cold, as though the sky itself had decided to spare it. "I've never seen it fall, grandmother," Editha told her one afternoon, watching the water run between the ancient stones. "Not even in the driest summer I remember." Hawaii's did not answer at once. She only filled her dipper, the same one her mother had left her, and looked long at the ring of half-sunken stones, as though trying to read in them an answer she did not yet fully understand. That night, kneeling before the small stone image of Our Lady of the Spring that her own father had taught her to venerate as a girl, a humble carving made by some forgotten shepherd, set in a niche beside the spring itself, she prayed not for vengeance, but for clarity. "Give me patience to see this through," she whispered, "and if there is a truth hidden in these stones, give me the courage to bring it to light when the right moment comes." It was during one such night of prayer that Father Cuthbert, after days spent searching the abbey's cartulary, found at last what he sought, an entry copied more than 60 years before, in faded, ancient hand, describing precisely the stone markers around the spring upon the hill of Ashcombe. Father Cuthbert climbed the hill with the cartulary copy wrapped in a cloth, his heart tight with a mixture of joy and fear he had not felt in years. He found Hawaii's beside the spring, filling her dipper with her usual calm. "Lady Hawaii's," he said, breathless from the climb, "I found it. The old entry from the abbey's cartulary, copied more than 60 years ago. It describes exactly the markers you found, they are the recorded bound of the spring. And by this valley's ancient custom, whoever holds the ground where the spring rises decides the turn of watering for every field that depends on it." Hawaii stood still a long moment, the dipper half full between her hands. "Every field in the valley, Father Cuthbert," she repeated, almost without voice. "Reynolds included." "All of them, Lady Hawaii's." "Without exception. But I warn you, this proof, brought to light too soon, will only provoke Reynolds to try to destroy it before it can be used. We need the right moment, and we need witnesses no one can question." She nodded, understanding the danger with the same clarity with which she understood every harvest, every drought, every hard year survived in 40 years of life in that valley. "Where will it be safest, Father Cuthbert?" "I will return the original to the abbey's keeping for now, Lady Hawaii's, but I will keep a copy hidden in my own house. And I will pray, every night, that summer does not bring the drought I fear is coming, for if it does, that will be when this proof must come to light before the whole manor court." Summer came with a force no one in the valley remembered having seen before. The spring rains had been scarce, and by mid-July the common wells began to show their bottoms, while the ditches that once ran generous from the hill let through only a thin trickle of murky water. Reynolds, growing ever more anxious as his own fields were threatened, sent one of his men to look into the matter, and the man returned with news Reynolds did not expect. The only spring in the whole valley still running strong was, precisely, the one at the croft he himself had given Hawaii's as though it were worth nothing. "That cannot be," Reynolds said, when the news was brought to him. "That spring was always the smallest and least reliable in the valley. There must be some error." But there was no error, and in the days that followed, as the main ditches kept sinking, more than one tenant began quietly climbing the hill to ask Hawaii's whether she might share a little water for their own dry wells. She, saying nothing of what she had discovered, shared what she could, watching in silence as the manor's balance of power began to shift in a direction no one, not even she herself, weeks before, could have imagined. Reynolds, alerted by rumors that Hawaii's had been asking questions of the parish priest, came to the church with his face tight with suspicion. "Father Cuthbert, I am told my father's widow has been consulting old records with you. What does she seek?" The priest, gathering a calm that cost him dearly, answered with the half-truth he had prepared for this moment. Lady Hawaii's asked after the history of the croft she inherited, Reynolds. "It is natural she should wish to know the land she now dwells upon. I do not like this. If she finds anything she might use against me, I want to know of it first. You serve this parish, and I am, now, the most important man upon this manor." The threat, though veiled, left no room for doubt, and Father Cuthbert felt, that same night, the same fear that had paralyzed so many keepers of secrets before him through the ages. It was Editha who, without fully knowing it, saved the situation. Learning from her own mother that Reynolds suspected her grandmother's visits to the priest, she climbed the hill that same evening with her face pale with worry. "Grandmother, Reynolds suspects something. He has threatened Father Cuthbert. I fear the proof may vanish before you can use it." Hawise, far from frightened, looked at her with a calm that surprised the young woman herself. "Editha, I need you to do something for me. Go to Father Cuthbert's house this very night, unseen, and ask him to give you the copy he keeps of the cartulary entry. Bring it here, to the croft, where no one will think to look for it." Editha carried out the errand with her heart pounding, and returned at dawn with the parchment wrapped in cloth, which Hawise kept beside the small image of Our Lady of the Spring, in the stone niche beside the very spring her own father had taught her to venerate as a girl. "Now we need only wait for the right moment," Hawise said, looking down at the parched fields stretching below, where the harvests of Reynolds and the other heirs were beginning to wither beneath a relentless sun. "And that moment, child, is coming faster than any of us would have wished." The drought reached its most critical point in mid-August, when the wheat harvests that should have gilded the fields of Reynolds and the other heirs stood instead withered and brittle beneath a merciless sun. The tenants, desperate, began demanding a solution from the manor court before the coming winter's hunger became more than a distant fear. It was Reynolds himself, pressed by the other heirs and by tenants growing ever angrier, who was forced to summon an extraordinary session of the manor court, not knowing that same session would be the stage of his own downfall. "I call this court," he announced before the crowded hall, his voice no longer as certain as it had sounded weeks before, "that we may decide, together, how to divide the little water that remains before we lose the whole harvest." Hawise, present among the tenants with Editha at her side, waited for Reynolds to finish before rising to her feet. "By this court's leave," she said, in a voice that, to her own surprise, did not tremble, "before we divide a water you believe scarce, there is something that must be laid before this court concerning the spring on my own croft." A murmur ran through the hall. Reynolds turned toward her, his face tense. "Lady Hawise, this is neither the time nor, by this court's leave," she repeated, not taking her eyes from the reeve presiding over the session. "I ask that Father Cuthbert, priest of this parish, be called to present a document touching directly upon the origin of the water that irrigates this entire valley." The reeve, an older man with a weathered face who had spent his life settling irrigation disputes across the shire, made a gesture of assent. "This court will hear what Lady Hawise has to present. No division of water may be made upon uncertain ground." Father Cuthbert came forward from the side of the hall with the old entry in hand, the same document he had guarded with fear for weeks. Before the eyes of the whole valley, he unrolled it and began to read, in a clear voice, the words his own memory had preserved for decades from an even older record. "The spring upon the hill of Ashcombe, with its stone markers set in the circle here described, belongs to the parcel of the croft, and by custom of this valley, whoever holds that parcel shall decide the turn of watering for every field that depends upon it," he read, in the firm voice of one finally freed of a weight carried too long. An absolute silence fell over the hall, broken only by the dry wind stirring dust at the tenants' feet. The reeve took the parchment in his hands, examined it carefully for several long minutes, and finally ordered that a party climb the hill with him to confirm the markers described in the document. A company of tenants, Reynolds among them, followed the reeve to the spring, where they found exactly what the entry described, stones set in a circle, half sunken beneath decades of moss, but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read them. "The markers match exactly what is described in the entry," the reeve declared, before all present. "The spring belongs, by ancient right, to Lady Hawise's parcel." Reynolds, his face pale and his hands trembling, attempted one last defense. This cannot be true. That croft was worth nothing when I gave it to her. No one knew of this. Precisely, Reynold, the reeve answered, with the calm authority of one who had seen such disputes his whole life through. No one knew, not even you. But the custom of this valley does not depend on what we know or do not know, but on what has been written and marked out for generations. In giving that parcel to Lady Hawise, you handed her, unknowing, the right over the water of this entire valley. The silence that followed had the weight of a grave slab. Hawise, standing before the whole court, showed no triumph nor satisfaction upon her face, only the same calm with which she had climbed the hill months before. "I seek no one's ruin," she said, when the reeve gave her leave to speak. "I ask only that what this valley's custom and justice have always ordained be acknowledged, and that from this day the division of water be made with fairness among all families, beginning with those most in need this summer." The reeve nodded, and so it was ordered before the whole manor court. If you have ever been given what no one else wanted, if you have ever been made to feel your worth depended on another's generosity, then this story is, in part, yours too. Hawise found no justice by shouting louder than those who shamed her. She found it by holding patience through weeks of uncertainty, even when fear whispered that the proof might be lost forever. May this story remind you, if ever you feel the world discards you for the years you carry, that dignity never depends on what others choose to give you, but on the firmness with which you hold what is rightfully yours. And that justice, however long delayed, always finds its way back to the one who never stopped deserving it. In the days following the court session, Hawise personally organized the division of water among the valley's families, beginning with the neediest and leaving, without more resentment than necessary, the fields of Reynold himself for last. "I will not deny you water, Reynold," she told him, when he climbed the hill, shamefaced, to ask for his turn of irrigation. "But you shall have no more than the others, nor less. That is all I ask, that no one in this valley decide another's fate again without justice." Reynold, his head bowed for the first time in years, accepted the terms without protest, and something in his manner toward Hawise began to change in the weeks that followed, though he never came to acknowledge it openly before the other heirs. Editha, whose quiet loyalty had sustained her grandmother's entire search, became over time Hawise's official assistant in administering the valley's water, learning from her not only the practical details of irrigation but also the patience and firmness with which her right could be upheld without falling into revenge. "I learned from you, grandmother, that justice need not shout to be heard," Editha told her, years later, when she herself administered the water division with the same fairness Hawise had taught her. "It needs only someone willing to wait for the right moment." Father Cuthbert continued serving the parish several years more, though with a transformed reputation. From a discreet, cautious priest, he became known as the man who had dared bring a truth to light that restored justice to an entire valley, even at the risk of crossing the manor's most powerful man. Hawise lived many more years in the hill croft, which over time ceased to be seen as a worthless parcel and became, in the valley's memory, the place where justice itself was born. She never moved to a better house, though she could have. She chose to remain beside the spring her father had taught her to use as a girl, tending it with the same care she gave every family that depended on its water. Each year, on the anniversary of the court session that restored her dignity, she had a candle lit before the small image of Our Lady of the Spring she kept in the niche beside the water, not in memory of the shame she had suffered, but as an offering of gratitude for the justice that, though delayed, always found its way back to the one who never stopped deserving it. Few in the valley of Ashcombe ever knew what it cost the reeve to make the decision he made that day at the manor court. He was not, as some imagined, a man who took pleasure in defying those with power. He had spent his whole life settling irrigation disputes among proud families, and in all that time had never had to overturn a division of land already settled in so public an act. That same night, before departing for his own district, he asked to speak with Hawise privately, away from the eyes of tenants still discussing what had happened in the hall. "Lady Hawise," he said, leaning on his staff beside the spring, "I would have you know I did not take this decision lightly. A reeve who favors one party without irrefutable proof loses all authority for the rest of his days. Had the entry Father Cuthbert presented carried the smallest doubt of authenticity, I would have had to set it aside, however much your story moved me.
I understand, sir, Hawise answered. And I thank you for hearing it with as open a mind as a heart.
There is something more I would tell you, he continued, an expression crossing his face that for the first time all day seemed genuinely his own. My own mother was widowed young, and spent years defending our households well from kin who sought to take it from her, claiming a woman alone could not manage it. I watched what it cost her to hold her ground. I recognized in you that same quiet firmness she had, and that, more than any document, was what convinced me to weigh your case with the care it deserved. Hawise, moved by a confession she had not expected from a man of his standing, could only nod in silence, feeling that night, for the first time in months, the weight upon her shoulders eased more than any official ruling alone had managed. In the years that followed, the story of the Ashcombe Spring became a matter of talk in neighboring manors, though told differently depending on who related it. Some presented it as a warning against the greed of heirs who scorn what they do not understand, others, as a lesson in the patience of widows who sustain in silence what they later claim with firmness, the devout, as proof that justice, however deeply buried beneath generations of moss, always finds someone to unearth it. An elderly widow from a neighboring manor, who had heard the tale from a wandering shepherd, traveled to Ashcombe months later to meet Hawise in person, beginning a friendship both women would treasure for the years remaining to them. I had never heard of a woman holding such patience before so public a humiliation, that widow told her, sitting beside the spring on an autumn afternoon. Nor had I ever seen such serenity in the moment of victory. Hawise answered with the same practical honesty that defined her, that dignity was not the absence of shame, but the daily, renewed decision not to let shame decide who you were. That conversation, remembered by both women for years, became in time a kind of informal counsel that circulated among widows of several manors in the Shire. Many years later, when Hawise was an old woman with hair gone entirely white but a back still straight, one of Editha's granddaughters asked her, as so many times before, to tell the story of the stones of the spring. "Tell it again, grandmother, the part about the stones covered in moss." "I have told it to you 20 times already, little one, and will likely tell it 20 more, Hawise would always answer, with a smile that no longer carried any pain. "But very well, once more. Sit beside me, near the water." And she would tell it, with the same precise details every time, how she had found the stone markers beneath the moss the first night at the croft, how Father Cuthbert had risked his standing in the parish to bring a forgotten record to light, how the reeve had confirmed before the whole valley a rite no one remembered. "And were you not afraid of Reynold, grandmother? When he gave you only the old croft?" "I was afraid, yes, a little afraid," Hawise would answer, always with the same disarming honesty. "But I learned, that very night I found the stones, that fear and patience can live within the same person. One need not stop being afraid to hold firm to what is rightfully yours. One need only never let fear decide in your place." The hill spring, its stone markers finally recognized and respected by the whole valley, became over the years a place where the neediest families knew they would always find fair water, no matter how powerful their neighbors, no matter how dry the season. The valley of Ashcombe prospered under the fair division of water Hawise had established, with a reputation for equity that spread well beyond its own borders. The humbler husbandman, who had witnessed both her humiliation and her restoration, spoke of her with a respect rarely granted to anyone in the Shire, precisely because Hawise never forgot what it felt like to be discarded as though she were worth nothing, and always treated those most in need with justice. Editha, now the acknowledged administrator of the water division, established a custom her own descendants would inherit. Whenever a dispute arose over boundaries or ditches in the valley, the first step was always to consult the old entries kept in the parish chest, so that no right would ever again be lost beneath the moss of forgetting. Let no one in this valley ever again wait 60 years for the truth of a spring to come to light, she would say often, echoing almost word for word what Father Cuthbert used to say of the Abbey's records. And so, generation after generation, the valley that had once witnessed the public shaming of a 66-year-old widow learned to tell that story not as an anecdote of shame, but as a reminder passed from grandmother to granddaughter beside the winter fire, that dignity, when held with patience, always finds its own way toward the light, no matter how many layers of moss try to hide it. 10 years after the court session that changed the valley's fate, when Reynold administered his own fields under the fair water division Hawise had imposed, a wandering shepherd trading wool through the shire stopped to spend the night in his house, not knowing who the man was who offered him table and shelter. Over supper, the shepherd, a man of easy talk, mentioned without malice that he came from a valley where they told the story of a widow who had recovered, thanks to forgotten stones beside a spring, the right over an entire valley's water. Reynold listened in silence, without revealing his identity, until the shepherd finished the tale. "And what became of the heir who shamed her?" he asked at last, in a voice that betrayed nothing. "What happened to him after he lost control of the water?" "They say he learned, with the years, to share what he once believed was his alone," the shepherd answered, not suspecting he spoke to the man himself. "Though I, if I may say so, believe we all deserve the chance to right a wrong, however great, if we have the humility to admit it in time." Reynold did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire, thinking of the years he had treated Hawise as a burden, of the fear that had led him to scorn what he did not understand, and of the lesson he had finally learned, late but not too late, about justice and humility. The next morning, before the shepherd departed, Reynold gave him a purse with more coin than a wandering shepherd usually received for a single night's hospitality. "Take this to the next church you find upon your road, and light a candle for a man who learned, late, to value what he once scorned. And if ever you return to that valley you speak of, and see an old woman beside a spring, tell her, if you dare, that the heir who shamed her learned, in the end, to be grateful." Hawise, receiving the shepherd's message years later through a tenant who had traveled the same road, listened in silence, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, with the same serenity that had carried her through the whole story, she answered, "Tell him, if ever you see him again, that I too learned something from all this, that justice does not seek to destroy the one who errs, but to restore to each what is rightfully theirs. And that I hope he found, on his own road, the same peace I found in this spring." The wooden dipper Hawise had carried with her the day of the division, inherited from her own mother, became over the years an object almost sacred to the women of the Ashcombe Valley. When a young woman married and left her parents' house, it became custom for her mother to give her a similar dipper, however modest, always accompanied by the same words Hawise had repeated her whole life. "Keep well what is yours, daughter, even if others tell you it is worth nothing. One never knows what forgotten spring hides the justice you will one day need." That custom, humble and quiet, outlived the exact memory of the details of Hawise's own story, becoming one of those traditions whose origin fades with the centuries, but whose deeper meaning remains intact in whoever practices it. A chronicler of the Shire, gathering decades later the most notable stories of the region for his own records, included a version of what happened at Ashcombe, with his own touches and additions, but always agreeing on the essential core of the tale, that an heir scorned for what he did not understand had unknowingly handed the key to an entire valley's justice to the very person he had wished to shame. Let it be recorded, for whoever reads this in generations to come, that chronicler wrote, citing words he attributed to Father Cuthbert himself shortly before his death, that justice does not always arrive by sword or by army, nor by the strength of powerful men. Sometimes it arrives hidden beneath the moss of a forgotten spring, or simply carried in the patient silence of a woman who refused, against every expectation, to disappear. Hawise died at 83, in the same hill croft where she had spent the last decades of her life, in springtime, with the windows open to the fresh air of the barley fields stretching below, green and thriving thanks to the fair water division she herself had established. Editha, elderly herself by then, held her hand until the very last moment. Her last words, as those present would later recount, concerned neither the division, nor Reynold, nor even the justice she had finally recovered. They were, simply, practical instruction given to her own great-granddaughter, a girl who carried with pride the inherited wooden dipper. Care for the spring, child. Not as a trophy, but as a duty. And when someone tries to tell you that what you have is worth nothing, remember that justice need not shout to be heard. It need only find someone willing to wait for the right moment. The spring upon the hill, its markers finally understood and respected by whole generations, continued watering the valley of Ashcombe for centuries, surviving droughts, distant and careless airs, and the slow wearing of time that erases most human stories without leaving even a single thread of memory. And whenever a visitor asked why so modest a croft held so much respect in the valley's memory, the answer they received, told by whoever kept the spring at that time, always ended with the same words Hawise had repeated so often beside the winter fire, that dignity, held with patience, always finds its own way toward the light, no matter how many layers of moss try to hide it. Among the humblest families of the valley who benefited from the fair water division Hawise established after the court session, none remembered that summer with more gratitude than that of Wulfric, a shepherd who owned little more than a small garden beside the dry stream and a dozen head of sheep that depended on a well which for weeks had given nothing but mud. Before the court session, Wulfric had been among the first to climb quietly to the hill to ask Hawise for a little water for his animals, ashamed to beg for what he once could have drawn from the common ditches without asking leave of anyone. "I have nothing to pay you with, Lady Hawise," he had told her, the first time he climbed, cap in hand and eyes lowered. "I can only offer my labor, should you ever need it." "Water is not sold, Wulfric," she had answered, filling her own dipper and then offering him the chance to fill his. "It is shared with whoever needs it most. Save your labor for the day you truly require it." That gesture, repeated week after week through the whole summer of drought, became the foundation of a loyalty Wulfric never forgot. When the day of the court session came and Hawise rose before the whole manor to claim her right, it was Wulfric who, from the back of the hall, was first to nod his head, giving the widow a silent support other tenants, more fearful of crossing Reynold, dared not show so openly. Over the years, Wulfric's family prospered under the fair division Hawise had established, and his eldest son, raised hearing the story of the spring from his own father, became one of Editha's first official helpers in administering the valley's water, tasked with walking the ditches each week to ensure no family received more or less than their due. "My father never forgot what that summer meant for us," Wulfric's son would say, grown to manhood, to whoever cared to listen. "Before the drought, we were always last to receive water when it ran short, because we had not land enough to make our voice heard. After that summer, everyone received the same, according to need and not according to power." That transformation, small in appearance but deep in its consequences, spread over generations across the whole valley of Ashcombe, changing not only how water was divided, but how humble families related to those who held more land and more voice in the manor court. Hawise, though she never sought recognition for these changes, watched them over the years with a quiet satisfaction, aware that the true measure of the justice she had claimed lay not in her own restored dignity, but in the way that dignity had spread, like the water itself, to those who most needed it. "I did not do this only for myself, Editha," she confessed one afternoon, already old, as they watched together how Wulfric's children watered their own fields without needing to climb and ask leave. "I did it because no one in this valley should depend on another's generosity for what is theirs by justice." Father Cuthbert, whose courage had brought the forgotten cartulary entry to light, spent his last years of service devoted to a task he called, often, the most important of his whole long life in the parish, cataloguing and recopying every old record in the parish chest, ensuring no right would ever again be lost beneath the dust of forgetting, as had nearly happened with the spring's entry. He trained a young clerk himself, a boy named Aldrich, son of a modest family in the valley with evident talent for reading old documents and, more important still in the old priest's eyes, with the same unshakable honesty it had cost Father Cuthbert so long to find the courage to practice. "A parish clerk does not serve the most powerful man in the manor, Aldrich," he would often repeat, through long afternoons of instruction in the small chest room beside the church. He serves the truth of the records. The day you confuse those two things, better to lay down your office and take up another trade, for a clerk who hides the truth out of fear is no clerk at all, only a servant with better handwriting. He told him, again and again, the story of the Ashcombe Spring, not as a personal triumph to boast of, but as a warning of how close he had come to failing his duty out of fear of Reynold. I came within a breath of staying silent, Aldrich. For days on end, I weighed whether it was worth risking my standing in the parish for a document that might have proved wrong or ill-remembered. And I confess something I have rarely said aloud: it was not courage that made me speak, in the end, but the shame I imagined I would carry the rest of my life had I chosen silence while the whole valley suffered thirst. Aldrich, who would succeed Father Cuthbert after the old priest's death, carried that lesson through his own half-century of service, and passed it in turn to his own successor, so that the story of the Ashcombe Spring became, within the small circle of parish clerks and reeves across the shire, a kind of founding parable each new keeper of records heard before taking up his office. Father Cuthbert died in his small chest room, surrounded by the very ledgers that had been his companions for a lifetime, several years after the court session that changed the valley's fate. His last words, as Aldrich would later recount, present in his final hours, concerned Hawise herself and the spring she had defended. "Tell Lady Hawise that I was right to seek that entry, though I took too long to find the courage. Tell her no document is worth more than the lives of those who depend on the truth it holds, Aldrich. Remember it always." Hawise, on hearing of the old priest's death, insisted on funding a small memorial to him within the parish church itself. With an inscription she dictated herself to the new priest: "Here is remembered a man who, when it cost him most, chose to speak the truth. May his memory teach the clerks who follow that no document is worth more than the honesty of the one who keeps it." Years after the court session, when the story of the Ashcombe Spring already circulated, transformed and embellished, among neighboring manors, a woman of middle years arrived one afternoon at the foot of the hill, asking after the house of the widow of the Fair Spring, as she was now called in some nearby shires. Her name was Alfreda, and she came from a manor several days' journey away, where her own family faced a dispute much like the one Hawise had faced years before, a powerful brother-in-law who administered the common lands and denied water to those he judged less deserving. "I have heard your story told 3 different ways, Lady Hawise, each with different details," Alfreda said, sitting beside the spring with a cup of fresh water in her hands. "But in all of them something repeats, that you did not shout, did not seek revenge, only waited for the right moment and held fast to what was rightfully yours." "That is more or less how it happened," Hawise answered, with a tired but sincere smile. "Though the shepherds and wandering minstrels always add some detail I myself do not recall living." Alfreda told her then of her own situation, and Hawise listened with the same patience she had learned across a whole lifetime of waiting for the right moment to speak. "I cannot tell you what to do, Alfreda," she said at the end of that long conversation. "Each woman must find her own truth and her own moment to bring it to light. But I can tell you this: search the old records of your own manor, however dusty they may be. One never knows what forgotten document hides the right you will one day need to defend." Alfreda left Ashcombe with a new resolve, carrying with her not only Hawise's counsel but also a small wooden dipper Hawise gave her at their parting, twin to the one she herself had inherited from her own mother. "Take it with you, child," Hawise said, placing the dipper in her hands. "And when you find your own spring, whatever it may be, remember that justice needs no haste. It needs only patience and the certainty that what is yours will, sooner or later, be acknowledged." Years later, a messenger arrived at Ashcombe with news from Alfreda's own manor. An ancient record, found at last in her manor's own chest, had confirmed her family's right to the common lands her brother-in-law had tried to seize. The tale, carried mouth to mouth among the shepherds who walked the roads of that shire, always ended with the same words Alfreda repeated to whoever would listen, that she had learned from an old woman beside a spring that justice, however well hidden, always finds someone to unearth it. Hawise lived to see 3 generations of her family grow up beside the spring she had defended with such patience, and in her last years, by then too old to climb and descend the hill as often as before, she spent her afternoons seated beside the stone niche where she kept the small image of Our Lady of the Spring, watching her great-grandchildren play among the stones that had changed the fate of an entire valley. It was in one of those last summers, feeling her strength fail, that she called Editha and the helpers Editha had trained over the years, to leave them one last instruction, clear and precise as everything she had done in life. "When I am gone, I want the division of water always decided in open court, never in private among the few," she said, her voice weakened but firm. "And I want the stone markers of this spring never again to be covered in moss, so no future heir may claim ignorance of what lay upon his own land." Editha, holding back tears, promised to keep every word, and did so for the rest of her own life, passing the same instruction to her own children and grandchildren, so that the memory of that summer of drought, far from fading with the passing centuries, became the quiet foundation upon which the entire valley of Ashcombe came to build its own understanding of justice. Hawice last summer came with the same scarce rains as so many others, but this time, thanks to the fair division she herself had established decades before, no family in the valley suffered the want that Reynold and the other heirs had suffered in that distant drought everyone still remembered. She died one morning at the end of August, with the sound of water running through the ditch beside her croft, the same one her own father had taught her to follow as a girl, long before the names of Osbert or Reynold had ever entered her life. She was buried, by her own wish, with the wooden dipper inherited from her mother in her hands, symbol of a whole life devoted to holding, with patience and without revenge, what was rightfully hers. The chroniclers of the Shire, gathering generations later the most notable stories of the region, always agreed upon the same close for the tale of the Ashcombe Spring, taken almost word for word from what Hawice repeated to whoever would listen beside the winter fire, that dignity, held with patience, always finds its own way toward the light, and that no spring, however well hidden beneath the moss of another's scorn, ever ceases to flow for the one who holds the right and the patience to await it. As the years passed, and with the fair division of water now firm custom in the valley, the tenants of Ashcombe decided to build beside the spring itself a small shrine dedicated to Our Lady of the Spring, replacing the humble stone niche where Hawice had kept for decades the carving her father had taught her to venerate as a girl. The idea came, in truth, from Wulfric the shepherd's own sons, grateful for life for the water that had saved their family from ruin in that summer of drought, and who wished to leave a lasting testimony of gratitude that would outlive the direct memory of those who had lived the events themselves. "It is not only for devotion," Lady Hawice, Wulfric's eldest son explained, when he came to ask her leave to build the shrine on land that remained hers. "It is so that, 100 years from now, when no one remembers your name or my father's, those who come to drink from this spring will know that here there was justice, and that justice and faith always walked together in this valley." Hawice, moved to tears for the first time in a long while, gave her leave without hesitation, and helped choose the exact spot where the small building would stand, taking care it should not block even a hand's breadth of the ditch that carried water to the lower fields. The shrine was completed 2 summers later, built of stone carried from the hill itself, with a small bell tower barely large enough for a modest bell, but one that was heard across the whole valley the first time it rang, calling the tenants to the dedication service the parish priest performed with particular solemnity. "We bless today not only this shrine, but the memory of the justice God allowed to flourish in this valley through the patience of a humble woman," the priest said, before the whole gathered community. "May this spring keep flowing, not only water for the fields, but also the memory that no true right stays hidden forever." From then on, every traveler passing through the valley on the way to greater shrines in the Shire stopped to drink from the spring and pray a moment before the image of Our Lady, now moved with full solemnity to the shrine's small altar, and many of them, asking after the place's history, carried Hawice's story away with them, to tell in turn in their own distant lands. The same reeve who had presided over the decisive court session, by then retired from his duties after decades of service across several manors of the Shire, devoted his last years to writing a small treatise on the customs of water division he had observed through his life, including a whole chapter devoted, without naming her directly out of respect for her modesty, to the case of the widow of the Ashcombe Hill. I have presided over dozens of water disputes in my life, he wrote in that treatise, which would circulate afterward among reeves of neighboring shires for generations, but none taught me so much as that court session in the summer of the great drought. I learned that the firmest justice is not that which is imposed by authority, but that which rests upon proof no one can question, brought forward by one who had the patience to wait for the exact moment to reveal it. The treatise, copied and recopied by successive clerks over the years, became required reference for any reeve taking up office across several manors of the shire, and the chapter devoted to Hawise, though it never named her in full, was known among reeves simply as the Lesson of the Spring. Aldrich, Father Cuthbert's successor as keeper of the parish chest, kept for his whole life the custom his master had taught him, to review the old entries in the parish records periodically, not waiting for a dispute to arise to do so, but as a regular practice ensuring no right would ever again be lost through neglect or fear. Every time I open this chest, I think of Lady Hawise. He once confessed to a young clerk he had begun to train, following the same tradition Father Cuthbert had begun with him. And I think how much suffering this valley might have been spared if someone, generations before, had done what we now do, guard the written memory as one guards water itself, without waiting for drought to force us to seek it in despair. That custom, quiet and constant, became over time one of the reasons the Valley of Ashcombe came to be known across the shire as a place where old rights were rarely lost, and where disputes between families were resolved, more and more often, by consulting dusty records instead of resorting to force or to the influence of whoever held more power in the manor court. What few in the valley expected was that, as generations passed, Reynolds' own family would come to defend, more fervently than anyone, the legacy of Justice Hawise had established. His eldest grandson, raised hearing from his own father, Reynolds himself, by then old and repentant, the full story of that summer of drought, became one of the most respected reeves the Valley of Ashcombe ever had. My grandfather told me this story differently than others tell it, that grandson, named Alfred, would say to the young people who came to ask him about the customs of water division. He did not tell it as his own defeat, but as the day he finally understood what justice truly meant. He said that until that summer he had confused power with right, and that Lady Hawise taught him, without meaning to, the difference. Alfred, faithful to that inherited lesson, devoted much of his life to strengthening the fair division customs Hawise had imposed, extending them even to boundary and common pasture disputes once settled only by force or by the influence of the valley's most powerful families. If my own grandfather could learn the lesson, late but in time, then anyone can learn it, he often said, when some younger tenant resisted accepting a division he thought unfair to his own interests. The question is not whether we have the power to impose our will, but whether we have the right to uphold it before everyone. It was Alfred himself who insisted the Springs Shrine be enlarged with a small room to keep, not only the old records, but also the new registers documenting every water division made since the court session that changed the valley's fate, so that no future generation could ever claim ignorance of their own rights and duties. Let it all be written, without exception, he insisted before the manor court, whenever it was debated whether it was necessary to formally document every decision touching the water. My own grandfather scorned a parcel because he did not know how to read what lay before him. Let us not allow that to happen again in this valley, neither with water nor with anything else that rightfully belongs to someone. That room, modest at first but enlarged over the years, became a kind of communal archive that other manors in the shire began to imitate, sending their own clerks to Ashcombe to learn the system of record-keeping that Alfred, grandson of the man who had shamed Hawise, had helped perfect in memory of the woman who taught him, without meaning to, the true meaning of justice. Hawise, though she did not live to see Alfred become a respected reeve, had known him as a child, when Reynold, by then repentant, brought his small grandson to visit her at the Hill Croft, in a gesture of quiet reconciliation neither of them needed to explain in words. "Why do we always visit this old woman, grandfather?" Alfred had asked once, as a boy, not fully understanding the story behind those visits. "Because she taught me something I hope you learn faster than I did, son," Reynold had answered, with a humility his own tenants scarcely recognized in the man he once had been. that a man's true wealth lies not in what he can take from others, but in what he is willing to acknowledge belongs, by right, to each. Those words, repeated years later by Ælfric himself to his own children and grandchildren, became a second family tradition running parallel to that of the valley's women with their wooden dippers, the tradition of Reynolds' descendants, who learned to measure their own worth, generation after generation, not by the lands they held, but by the justice with which they administered them. Despite all the changes brought by the passing centuries, new courts, new families, new customs that came and went with each generation, there was something in the valley of Ashcombe that never changed. The very hill where Howise Croft stood continued to be called, on the lips of every tenant, the Widow's Hill, though the official name recorded in the manor's documents was something else entirely. The valley's children, generation after generation, grew up hearing that name without always knowing where it came from, until some grandmother or grandfather, seated by the fire on a winter's night, told them the whole story, how a woman shamed with what seemed the worst share of an inheritance had come to hold, through patience alone, the justice of an entire valley. And is it true the spring never ran dry, not even in the worst summer? The youngest always asked, eyes wide before the fire. As true as the water still running today along that same ditch beside the church, whoever told the story always answered. And more important still, as true as this, that in this valley, since then, no one has ever again decided another's water without truth and justice having their turn to speak as well. The shrine of Our Lady of the Spring, enlarged several times over the centuries, became a required stop for travelers crossing that part of the Shire, not so much for its size, which always remained modest, as for the fame of the story told within its walls, written at last in a small book the manor itself had bound so that no detail would be lost with the passing generations. In that book, kept beside the altar in a carved wooden chest, one could read, in careful hand copied down generation after generation by successive parish clerks, a closing line that summed up, better than any other source, the whole legacy of Howise Alderton. Here it is remembered that justice did not come to this valley by force of arms nor by the will of the powerful, but by the silent patience of a widow who, shamed with an empty croft, knew how to wait for the day when truth, hidden beneath the moss of the years, finally found someone with the courage to unearth it. Let whoever reads this remember also that no spring ceases to flow for the one who holds right over it, however much others may try to turn it to their own advantage. And so, century after century, the hill that the official records called by one name, but that the whole valley kept calling the Widow's Hill, continued watering the fields of Ashcombe with the same clear, constant water Howise had defended with her own patience, reminding each new generation that dignity, held without haste and without revenge, always finds its way back toward the light in the end. Of the original wooden dipper Howise had carried with her the day of the division, little remained physically by the time later centuries turned it into a relic kept, not in daily use, but in the very carved wooden chest where the manor preserved the book with the full story of the spring. Its edges worn smooth by generations of hands, its wood cracked in more than one place but never broken through, became the object the valley's children asked to see whenever some grandparent told them the story by the fire. "May I touch it, grandmother?" some child would always ask, with the same reverent respect with which one touches something sacred. "Gently, child," whoever held the chest's key would always answer. This dipper carried the water that saved an entire valley from thirst and injustice. It deserves the same care Lady Howise gave to every person who climbed to ask her for help. That custom of showing the dipper to the valley's children, passed down generation after generation alongside the story itself, ensured no inhabitant of Ashcombe grew up without knowing, firsthand and not only by hearsay, the physical object representing the whole lesson Howise had left behind, that dignity does not depend on what others choose to give you, but on the quiet firmness with which you hold what is rightfully yours, even when the whole world around you laughs at how little it seems worth. Travelers who, centuries later, stopped out of curiosity in the valley of Ashcombe and asked why a simple wooden dipper deserved such care always received the same brief answer from whoever kept the chest at that time, that the dipper had climbed a hill carrying only water and dignity, and had come down, over the years, carrying the justice of an entire valley. And that, So long as that story kept being told beside every winter fire, no other shamed widow in Ashcombe would ever again have to climb her own hill alone without knowing the whole valley, this time, would be ready to listen to her from the very first day. Whoever visits the Valley of Ashcombe today, and climbs with curiosity up to the shrine beside the spring, will still find, carved in simple letters upon the stone of the threshold, the last line Hawise asked to be written before she died, the very one that sums up, better than any chronicle, the whole meaning of her story, that water, like justice, never belongs to whoever shouts loudest for it, but to whoever has the patience to wait, with dignity intact, for the day it is finally acknowledged. However many winters must pass before that long-awaited day arrives. In the very last months of her long life, when her strength barely sufficed to sit each morning beside the spring, Hawise received a visit from a young woman of the neighboring village, promised in marriage to a man whose family administered, not always fairly, the common lands of their own district. "I have heard it said, Lady Hawise, that you know how to face an injustice without losing yourself in the effort," the young woman said, sitting beside her on the stone worn smooth by years. "I am soon to marry into a family that treats the weak much as you once were treated, and I do not know if I will ever have the courage you had." Hawise looked at her a long while, her eyes veiled by age but still capable of that same quiet attention that had always marked her, and answered with words the young woman would remember for the rest of her life. "Courage, child, is not the absence of fear, nor the certainty of winning. It is the decision, renewed each single day, not to let injustice become ordinary simply because no one contests it. I do not ask you to be braver than I was. I ask only that you never forget what is rightfully yours remains yours, even when others laugh at how little it seems worth in the eyes of the world." The young woman left Ashcombe with those words carved into her heart, and years later, when her husband's family tried to deny her a share of inheritance that was rightfully hers, she found in the memory of that conversation beside the spring the strength to hold firm until justice, however delayed, was finally acknowledged before her own manor court, exactly as it had happened to Hawise so many years before. It was that same young woman, by then a mature and respected woman in her own district, who one day sent a messenger to Ashcombe bearing gifts for the spring's shrine and a letter that Editha, elderly herself by then, read aloud before the whole village gathered for the annual feast of Our Lady of the Spring. "I have never forgotten that afternoon beside your spring," the letter read, "nor the words of a woman who had already given all she had to give this world, and yet found time still for a frightened stranger. May this offering help keep the memory of Hawise Alderton alive for 100 generations more, so that no other shamed woman need ever feel alone upon her own road toward justice." Editha, moved to tears, had those very words carved upon a small stone tablet beside the shrine, where they would remain legible for centuries, quiet testimony that Hawise's lesson had not stopped at the borders of her own valley, but had crossed hills and whole shires, carried by whoever had the fortune to sit, even for a single afternoon, beside that spring which never ceased to flow. From that day onward, each year, during the feast of Our Lady of the Spring, a young person of the village was chosen to read aloud, before the whole community gathered around the water, both Hawise's original story in that letter which had traveled so far, so that no future generation might ever forget how far, in time and in distance, the quiet patience of a single shamed widow upon a forgotten hill had come to reach. And when, many years later, Editha's own great-grandchildren asked why so small a valley kept a story with such care, in a bound book, on a carved tablet, in a dipper kept as relic, the answer they received was always the same, passed down word for word from those who had the privilege of knowing Hawise in person, that some stories deserve to be kept not because the events they tell are extraordinary, but because they teach, better than any sermon, that the quiet patience of a single person, held to the very end, can truly change the fate of an entire place, of an entire family, and of every generation still to come, in Ashcombe and wherever else this story might still, in years to come, find someone willing to listen with the same respect it was told the very first time. And perhaps, the eldest of the village always said, finishing the tale beside the fire, that is precisely why so small a spring, upon so poor a hill, in a valley no map of the realm would ever trouble itself to mark with particular care, still deserve to be remembered, because justice, when it finally finds the way to make itself known, needs no great armies nor grand halls to do so. It needs, often, only one faithful spring, one patient heart, and the time required for the two to meet at last in the moment that was always meant to be theirs. And anyone who, even now, climbs that steep path leading to the Widow's Hill, short of breath and tired of leg just as Hawaii's must have been on that first day so many centuries ago, finds waiting beyond the last bend the same clear water that flowed then, faithful, quiet, indifferent to passing time, yet still carrying within it every unshed tear, every carefully measured word, and every small victory a single woman, with a ring of forgotten stones and a heart that never stopped hoping, rested. Drop by drop from the unjust silence of men, until it became, with time and with faith, the river of justice that even now carries her name in a whisper among the stones of that distant valley, for anyone with ears willing to listen and a heart willing to believe that even the smallest inheritance, held with dignity, can be enough to change the course of everything, even when the whole world, in that first moment of public shame, seemed utterly, entirely, hopelessly, achingly certain of the harsh and cruel contrary, and nothing more at all.